Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Dr. Nick Bloom. He's a professor at Stanford and an expert in hybrid work and remote work. So, Nick, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you for having me on, Gleb.
And can you tell me a little bit more about your research on having cameras on during meetings or off during meetings? What have you found useful about that?
Well, it came about because I was kind of surprised by a number of execs and companies I've talked to bemoaning the fact that people would not have cameras on in meetings. You know, the two of us having a camera on now, and it never really struck me that it would be normal to turn your camera off in a meeting of 2, 3, 4 people. But in multiple companies I've spoken to, they were complaining, senior managers were saying, look, it's really frustrating. We have these Zoom meetings or Teams or WebEx or whatever, and there are people with their cameras off. And I was like, surely that can't be right. And they're like, no, it's quite common. So we survey 10,000 Americans a month in this survey of workplace attitudes and arrangements. And it's people aged 20 to 64 that are working or looking for work. So it's basically working Americans. And we asked them two different types of questions. One is what share of people have their cameras on in meetings of various sizes? And the other is how does it affect engagement? And the first factor was even in small meetings of 4 people or less, less than half of people have their cameras on all the time, which struck me as pretty amazing. If you look at it, it tends to be older employees and educated employees in particular. So people with a university degree are much more likely to have their camera on. So if you look at it, who's not got their cameras on, it's going to be someone that left school at 18, maybe in their 20s. You know, maybe they're less, they're less senior in the meeting. So that was one factor. A surprisingly large number of people didn't have their cameras on. When you go to bigger meetings, you definitely see less people have their camera on. But, if you're in a meeting of 30 people, that's hardly surprising. So fact one was, I was stunned by how many people don't turn them on. Fact two is even more surprising, given that was, we asked people, how does it affect your engagement from very positive, negative, neutral, negative, or very negative? And 50% of people said it makes them more engaged having their cameras on. And almost the same number of people said it makes other people who are in meetings with them feel more engaged. So it's very symmetrical. So I not only as a respondent, we thought people may say, well, I pay attention when my camera's off, but everyone else doesn't. We don't see that. So half of people say they and others seem less engaged. And in fact, I think, of that, about half of them say a lot less engaged with their cameras off. About a third say it has no effect. And about a sixth, the remainders, like 15%, say it actually makes them more engaged. But, the numbers were pretty clearly that having your camera on makes you more engaged and makes you think other people are more engaged.
Now, I think makes a lot of sense to me in terms of what we could expect to be the case. But I want to talk about fatigue. So there was a study in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2021 showing that when people have their cameras on, it causes them to be more fatigued. And so it's a peer-reviewed study. We have pretty good credibility there. So what are your thoughts about that, this kind of trade-off and optimization, the trade-off between people being more fatigued versus being more engaged in the meeting?
I think it's totally consistent. So when you're more engaged, you're using more brain power, you're concentrating more, and it is definitely more tiring. So, think of sitting a maths exam. If you're trying really hard and care about it, you're going to feel much more fatigued than if you don't care and you just, randomly tick answers. So I think my advice would be for companies and managers, one is particularly in smaller meetings, have a norm to have the camera on, strongly encourage it. There are some people with exceptions, but you may claim that, certainly early in the pandemic, before there were virtual backgrounds, people didn't really want to see what's going on behind them. But we're 3 years on and, everything has virtual backgrounds. And you can also stand against the wall if you're worried about it. So I think there'd be a strong norm to have cameras on, A. And point B is avoid having like continuous back-to-back meetings. Now, it's the way to get around that is to have a lot of companies, and in fact, universities have this. We have what's called there's Harvard and MIT have Harvard time. So Stanford doesn't, interestingly, but Stanford leaves 10 minutes between every class. So if you do a class from 1 to 2:30, actually you're only allowed to teach from 1 to 2:20, and it leaves exactly 10 minutes to move across. I think we need the same thing that we have physically on Zoom. So, for example, meetings have to stop at 5 minutes to the hour or 5 minutes to the half hour, and it gives people a chance to stand up, stretch, go to the bathroom. I think the fatigue problem is really severe if you've got back to back. I mean, I've had this. I'm sure we've all had this when one meeting's over and you can see in you get an email if you're the scheduler that your next person is John. I'm like, oh, like I'm going to go back to back and I could be here for 3 hours and it's getting really hard.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an issue. Whenever I work with clients, I have them institute a half hour, finishing the meeting at the half hour. If it's a half hour meeting, doing 25 minutes. If it's an hour long meeting, doing 50 minutes. That's definitely a good practice. I think
I noticed that. I actually saw that on your scheduler. I totally agreed. I said, that's clever. I like it. You're in best practice there.
Yeah, I default to that. So I think that's really helpful. I think it's interesting kind of about the small meetings and where people having that practice of having their meetings, the cameras on and off. It's the struggle with that is people do feel burned out. So I'm kind of, should there be some standards by how you decide, okay, this meeting is important enough, regardless of whether it's small or not? Can it be maybe a standard of importance? Like the weekly stand-up meeting when everyone is just sharing their reports. Maybe just the person who's presenting can have their cameras on. Maybe the rest of the people don't have to. But when you're doing a meeting like a collaboration meeting where you need to be more intense and engaged and actually paying attention to other people's body language, that might be a time to have your cameras on, to not drain people too much. What are your thoughts about having certain meeting standards about whether the meeting is important enough for you to actually observe other people's body language and be fully engaged or not?
It's a good question. I mean, one alternative taken at is imagine the weekly report-in meeting where there's 25 managers reporting in. If it's the case that only one needs to have their cameras on it, maybe that's just not necessary, or maybe the meeting's far too long. So I think if it's the case, look, if there's 25 managers and only one has their camera on, of the other 24, at best, if you're lucky, half are paying attention. The other half are doing email, they're like doing a workout, they're getting their kids dressed for school, whatever it is. So if it's the case that you don't really need to pay attention, you should then ask the bigger question, why do I need to have the meeting? And maybe you move to a written format. So it might be, I often like reading stuff because I can go at my own pace. And so it's, it's faster, it's a more efficient way of taking on board information. I think if it's, the other extreme of just two people, if it's me and you, we could easily do this over the phone, because clearly you're not going to not pay attention in a two-person meeting. You're going to play close to full attention. Where it feels like it's hard is where there's 5 or 6 people. And in fact, there's that paper in Nature by Jonathan Levave and Melanie Brooks about a year ago about people in person are more creative in meetings than they are on Zoom. And one of the arguments is on Zoom, they're not really paying attention. You only have, 50% of people. I've noticed when I've taught in the pandemic year, the very peak pandemic year, when everything was totally in person when I teach, you could see with students, particularly students who had no other lights on, so their face was lit up by the computer screen. Sometimes their face seemed to be changing color and you're like, they're watching Netflix. They're just, so it's kind of like, I think the same problem with meetings. If you have 5, 6 people and your camera's off, it's much easier to be doing email. And then you're like, well, look, this is really only a meeting with 2 or 3 people. So I think if it's so non-critical that folks can be giving it half attention, I'd probably cancel it and convert it to something written, or have it faster with a few people with just the focus stuff. And if it is critical, I'd probably just have cameras on. And as you say, if it's an hour, stop at 10 minutes to the hour.
Okay. Yeah, that's convincing to me. I think that's a really good point, that it's if it's not that important for you in a smaller meeting, at least, to have your camera on, maybe you should not be having the meeting at all. That's a good way of thinking about it. I'll think about how to talk about that to my clients, because it's definitely an issue I've been hearing about quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, on that, there's an interesting study. I'm trying to remember all the list of co-authors. One of them was my co-author and other stuff, Raphael Asadin at Harvard Business School. There's a number of others, but they looked at data from Microsoft, and what they show is during the pandemic, meetings became more frequent. They're actually shorter on average, but there's so many more of them that the total meeting time went up. And their take on it was basically people want to be inclusive. So I have a meeting of 6 people. I don't want to leave anyone out. So I then invite all 20 people that might be interested. But if I'm a senior manager, they then feel like they've got to turn up because, if their boss has invited them, it seems rude not to come. And so you end up with these huge meeting bloat, meetings of 20, 30 people. And so it's interesting. We're on Zoom. I was talking to Eric Yuan, who's the founder and CEO of Zoom, and he was saying they have a pretty strict policy on you've got to clearly explain what the meeting's for, the purpose and why it is, and anything that doesn't, they have to express it before setting it up. So he says it's the only way. It's like, if you're a gardener, it's like cutting back the weeds. That unless you do that, the whole day gets filled with these meetings of 30, 40 people. And he says he's got to keep it under control. And that's the way he does it.
And that's an interesting position to take from the person who's in charge of Zoom, which is, of course, incentivized for having more people in the meeting, right?
Yeah, I think Eric's view was, look, there's a right number. You maybe want to spend, I don't know, 5, 6. I mean, it's hard to know. It depends on person to person. Look, if you're a senior manager, you probably spend more time in meetings, but you still need some time for reading, for writing, for thinking. I mean, thinking, I know other people find, but certainly, quiet reflection is quite productive. I wouldn't spend an hour, you can easily lapse into looking out the window and daydreaming, but having a bit of space, 10 minutes between each meeting. Like before we talked, to be honest, I went back and looked briefly at the camera on research just to refresh myself. If I'd gone back to back, I wouldn't have had that. And then this will be a less productive meeting itself.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you. That was very helpful, Nick. I really appreciate your sharing your expertise.
No, it's great. It's great to catch up. It's like the science of meetings is very important, but much understudied.
Okay. And thank you to the listeners for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. All right, everyone. I look forward to seeing the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. And in the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.